Peter Walsh has just left Clarissa Dalloway's house after an unfortunate scene. We're about to spend some time with him as he walks around London and reflects on the past. Peter's a complex person, like Clarissa, and often gets lost in memories and wallows in regret. Some might even call Peter a failure, but he seems to call himself that more than anyone. Peter is on the run, or at least he feels like he is, from Clarissa and all the uncomfortable memories and feelings her presence evokes. And as for him bursting into tears just now, what on earth was that all about? Also, the way Clarissa said, "Here's my Elizabeth," when the girl came in was so odd and over the top. Then there's this party of hers. Peter's not sure whether he wants to face all those people. He knows they all think he's a failure. Big Ben chimes in the distance, marking the half hour. With each rippling boom, Peter can still hear Clarissa's voice. "Remember my party? Remember my party?" Peter is dismayed by Clarissa's shallowness. Doesn't she realise he has something better than status and money? He's in love. But all this outrage and frustration can't ward off a creeping, cold feeling in Peter. Clarissa had rejected him all those years ago. He was never good enough for her. The memory of it makes Peter feel hollow and utterly alone. He arrives at Trafalgar Square, weighed down by a cloud of loneliness. Other than Clarissa, no one else knows he's back from India. Actually, come to think of it, that's a good thing. This realisation changes Peter's mood, and he embraces a sense of freedom and daring. He spots a beautiful girl in the crowd and imagines that she's the one he's always dreamed of. It's just a fantasy, but that's all Peter needs to feel adventurous and young again. Finding a seat in Regents Park, Peter looks out at the scene before him. It's so London, and Peter feels proud to claim this vibrant civilization as part of his heritage. But of course, he was so much more than London. He was Borton too, and Clarissa. Seeing her again after so many years has opened the floodgates, and just like that, he's back in Borton again. There's Clarissa and that ragamuffin Sally Seton. Richard Dalloway is there, and so is Clarissa's father, old Justin Parry. Wrapped up in nostalgia and the warm summer air, Peter sleepily throws aside the remains of his cigar and floats off to sleep. He dreams of himself as a solitary traveller, doomed to forever wander the world alone, desperately, incurably alone. This suffocating sense of doom jolts Peter awake, and he exclaims, "The death of the soul!" Perplexed by his own outburst, he digs around in his mind for its trigger. Ah yes, memories of Borton. But what's all this about the death of the soul? It's Clarissa. Peter feels like her soul, her life spark, has been snuffed out. Still, there's more to this memory. It was summertime in Borton when he was passionately in love with Clarissa. It was the same summer that Clarissa met Richard Dalloway. Peter remembers seeing them and realising, like a bolt of lightning, that she would marry Richard. Oh, the thought had haunted him for days, but in his heart, Peter knew he would have been a terrible match for Clarissa. He always demanded too much of her. He would have smothered her with his moods and neediness. Peter had to accept that Clarissa would marry Richard and that it was somehow for the best. But that still didn't prepare him for their final moments together. Saying goodbye to Clarissa was a defining moment for Peter. He believes it mattered more to him than anything else in his life. It was the heat of the day, 3 in the afternoon. He had sent a note to Clarissa via Sally, asking Clarissa to meet him by the fountain. He will forever remember her, standing on the other side of the fountain, so still with her terrible secret. Peter had to beg her to reveal the truth. Clarissa was engaged. The terrible memory fades, and Peter refocuses on the present moment in Regents Park. He sees a little girl run past him and straight into a poor, unsuspecting woman. That woman is Lucrezia Warren Smith. She does not know Peter, but this shows how closely people live alongside one another, especially in a place like Regents Park. Regezia has briefly walked away from her husband Septimus, who's having another episode. She's terribly unhappy. Septimus says cruel things to her and is often in a world of his own. But his talk of suicide is what alarms her the most. Frustrated, but also driven by duty, Regezia returns to her husband. But now he's talking to himself, or to that dead man, Evans. He was a good friend of Septimus's, who was killed in the war. Now Septimus sees him all the time. But didn't everyone lose someone or something important during the war? Regezia reflects on her own sacrifice and how she certainly lost something, perhaps everything, when she married Septimus. But the man sitting next to her now is not the Septimus she married. He's grown so strange. He hears voices beyond their bedroom walls and says he saw an old woman's head in the middle of a fern. But he could also be happy too. They used to go on bus rides around the city. On these occasions he was perfectly fine, until it was interrupted by one of his horrific episodes. Regezia remembers how she had walked Septimus home, listening to him rant about the wickedness of people and how he knew all their thoughts. When they had arrived home, he lay on the sofa and made her hold his hands. He cried out that he was falling into flames, surrounded by laughing faces and hearing accusing voices that he argued back with. This was all too much for her. She wants to go home. Why did Dr. Holmes assure her that there is nothing wrong with Septimus? Can't he see that there is something very wrong with him? Septimus goes to hold Rezia's hand and notices that she's not wearing her wedding ring. She reassures him that it's only because she's grown too thin to wear it. She tries to make him aware of her suffering, but he convinces himself that she's abandoned him and their marriage is over. Actually, Septimus feels relieved until he's dragged down into another overwhelming episode. He begins to obsess over the true meaning of life while being haunted by visions of Evans. Regezia looks on helplessly as Septimus fades from reality. Peter observes Regezia and Septimus from a distance, feeling sorry for them as their public scene plays out. What could that man possibly be saying to the poor girl to make her look so desperate? And on such a beautiful morning. London had never looked so beautiful, especially after 5 years in India. Peter sees how London has dramatically changed in those 5 years. People look and act so differently now. Look at all the makeup the women are wearing. He thinks of Sally, who never cared what people thought of her. But what had happened to the wild, daring and romantic Sally? She'd gone and married a rich man and now lives in a big house near Manchester. But when they were younger, Sally despised the upper class, especially the Whitbreads. She couldn't stand Hugh's vanity and how he worshipped the British aristocracy. But hadn't something happened? Sally claimed that Hugh had insulted her, perhaps even kissed her. But no one would believe Sally's word over Hugh's. After all, Sally was a nobody and a wild child. Hugh was the respectable one. Well, as much as Peter resents Hugh, he also needs him. Peter needs a job. And at the age of 53, with a new wife to provide for, Peter will rely on Hugh's connections. Peter's thoughts then turn to Richard Dalloway. Richard isn't a very interesting man, but he is practical. Peter thinks Richard is wasted in politics and would have been better off as a country gentleman. All the more reason why it's so perplexing that the poetic and passionate Clarissa chose to marry such a pragmatic man. Perhaps opposites do attract. Sally had once begged Peter to save Clarissa from Richard, who was the perfect gentleman but would stifle her soul. Sally was terrified that Richard would turn Clarissa into a glorified party hostess. But Peter wonders if Sally ever appreciated how clever Clarissa truly was. Clarissa was an incredible judge of character and could command a room full of people. But Peter wasn't in love with Clarissa anymore. Yet he could not stop thinking about her. And here she is, always throwing parties for Richard. It was no burden to her either. Clarissa had chosen this role. Ultimately, Clarissa always needed people. Peter thinks he's too old now to need people. This present moment is enough. Peter realises that he thinks about Clarissa more frequently than he does about Daisy, his fiancée. Was he really in love with Daisy then? Perhaps not. At least, not when he remembers those extraordinary days at Bourton. Peter's thoughts are interrupted by a soft singing. A woman is singing outside the Regents Park tube station. Peter stands and listens carefully to the sweet, haunting voice. It conjures visions in his mind of an ancient and profoundly important love story. Can Lucrezia and Septimus hear the old lady's song as well? What about their love story? Is there a way to save it? We hope you enjoyed this Schooling Online production. For more easy lessons, check out our other videos.